Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Monday, the 18th of August, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. With that, let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway, starting with D.C. here. All right, so, Robert, good morning. Democrats have accused President Trump of doing this D.C. takeover, sending in National Guard, sending federal law enforcement, and we covered this a little bit last week, but if you would please give us the over weekend details.
So over the weekend, South Carolina, Ohio, and West Virginia said they're going to deploy National Guard troops to Washington, D.C. this week. So far, it looks like at least 750, but the DoD has said 800 will be deployed. And that's 200 from South Carolina, 300 to 400 from West Virginia, and interestingly, 150 specifically military police National Guard troops from Ohio. And the DoD has also said that National Guard troops currently are unarmed, but there is an Army spokesman who said that they could be armed starting this week. And a White House official also said that they're going to protect federal facilities and help other law enforcement agencies make arrests.
Mm-hmm. You know, I just want to point something out. I was on the MPD website, the DC Metro Police Department website this morning, and you look at their staffing numbers. They have about 3,200 on staff right now this year. That is down by about 800 from 2020. And so you have this head of the DC Police Union saying, coming down and saying the crime statistics are cooked. They're way undercounting the actual volume of crimes happening in DC. You have DC Mayor Muriel Bowser coming out over the weekend, basically admitting that 800 National Guard troops will help fill the gaps of this 800 officer shortage that MPD currently has, and yet this is still a fascist takeover. Let's just put that into context. The Metro Police have a police officer shortage, and so National Guard and federal law enforcement are helping make up that difference. All right, let's go ahead and move on, and we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here talking about maybe a Democrat majority past the midterms. But Eric Swalwell, a Democrat representative from California, says that he is going to unmask ICE.
Correct. It is getting a little ahead of, they are getting a little ahead of themselves here, I think. But Swalwell did say if Democrats gain a majority, I think he was talking about a governing trifecta, but he could also be talking about a House majority in 2026, that they're going to unmask ICE agents who are, quote, roaming around like bank robber bandits. And he said that they were going to be unmasked literally and figuratively, and there's going to be accountability for ICE agents. I think this is a clear threat to dox ICE agents if Democrats do gain a majority in the House next year, and they would do this through the subpoena powers on the House committees to get a hold of this ICE agent info and hold hearings, etc. on it. I don't think there's really any way that Democrats do not know that there are left-wing activists that would use that info to target ICE and Border Patrol agents.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen any opinion polling about how Americans feel about masked ICE agents?
I haven't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so amazing to me that there's so many Democrats who are on the siding with illegal aliens over siding with the country, Americans. And so I do wonder how well this is going to play in the midterms. It's almost, we hear from Kristi Noem, DHS secretary, and the acting ICE director, I think his name is Lyons, and other people saying that attacks on ICE agents are up 400%, 500%, 800%, whatever percentage they're talking about. It's astronomical. And it seems to have been rising over the past several months. It just seems like it really seems to me like nobody cares. Nobody outside of ICE and maybe some conservatives actually cares that ICE agents are being attacked. It's a little bit unbelievable. But Robert, I'll give you the last word and we'll move on.
No, I think that's pretty succinct. It is unusual to me that there's very little response, even from Republicans, on the massive amount of including violent resistance to immigration enforcement.
Mm-hmm. And you would think, you really would. Well, listen, we'll move on. All right, speaking of violence against ICE, there was this ICE officer involved shooting. This was over the weekend.
Yes, and this was in San Bernardino, California, and the police department, they confirmed that ICE agents fired at a fleeing vehicle after the driver fled an ICE and Customs and Border Protection traffic stop. The DHS says that 2 CBP officers were injured when the vehicle fled. And then Homeland Security investigations attempted to arrest the driver at his home after the driver called the San Bernardino police, but they left after a crowd formed around the residence during basically a 4-hour standoff. They showed up at 11 in the morning and left around 4 p.m. And I think that this incident is probably going to be used as a media campaign to boost more anti-ICE protests.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is assault with a deadly weapon using a vehicle, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. All right. So I guess they'll say that the shooting was justified.
I think DHS will. So the reason why the reason why it seemed to me that the arrest did not actually happen, they didn't leave with the driver, was that San Bernardino police apparently they said that the California Values Act prevented them from cooperating with ICE, and all they did really was crowd control, I guess, to stop it from getting out of hand. And the HSI agents probably thought that they were going to spark some kind of confrontation if they did try to leave with the guy driving the vehicle.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this is very important. Robert, we have heard for years that police officers do not police certain areas because the juice is kind of not worth the squeeze. Basically, they don't want to get themselves in a bad situation where they're outnumbered, and so they just basically say, we're not even going to go into these areas. Effectively no-go zones. And then I want to bring this up because this is extremely important. And now there's a difference between maybe a couple of ICE agents going and conducting immigration enforcement or trying to make an arrest, or HSI or whoever. And that's one of the things that ICE officials have talked about, like Director Lyons, is ICE used to be able to send in 2 officers to a jail, like a county jail, and get their detainee. And then now they're having to do 4 to 6 officers, sometimes up to 10 officers, because they do not get any help whatsoever from local law enforcement. And so basically, you're in this situation where ICE resources are being sapped because they're not getting cooperation from local law enforcement. Okay, let's just throw that out there as context. This is something, maybe this is not exactly competitive control, but this is something that David Kilcullen has talks about in his books. Like Out of the Mountains is a great book. It is about guerrilla movements coming out of the mountains, and this is like the age of the urban guerrilla here. This is basically what this book is all about. And he talks about competitive control, where basically you have a local gang that is taking some form of legitimate power away from local government. And, maybe this is not the best analogy or the best explanation here, but it's kind of inconceivable that law enforcement cannot go and arrest someone who has at least alleged to have committed assault with a deadly weapon by using his vehicle as a weapon, and that they just can't go in there and arrest the guy because there's too many people blocking their way, or because they don't want to be attacked themselves during this process. That's where the country is. It's insane.
Well, I think in this case, it's an example, if you're talking about competitive control of state Democrats versus federal authority, because the law enforcement agencies, I think in this case, California law enforcement agencies aren't helping, not because they're afraid to help. At least they're afraid of like the crowd. I think they're afraid to lose their job because the California Democrats and Colorado Democrats, Illinois, et cetera, have basically curtailed any type of local support for immigration enforcement. And I mean, we saw it in the past in other areas like legalization or decriminalizing cannabis. That was the reason why the DEA rolled back a lot of enforcement in these states, is because they stopped getting local cooperation. So I think in this case, it's sort of a struggle between 2 different state actors rather than a state and non-state actor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair point. I'm just pointing out, if they had local law enforcement cooperation, they could go and make the arrests they need to, but they can't. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on here to the global sit rep. Starting with Taiwan. Jared, take it away.
Quick note on Taiwan, they're reclassifying drones as munitions in order to mimic the U.S.'s system, which will speed up acquisition. They also announced they're getting a couple hundred extra missiles this year. They said by next year, so here, which is enormous. And those are all domestically produced. And this is really just Taiwan's continuing a rapid buildup and increasing its acquisition in all areas as much as possible. Moving on much closer to home, the U.S. is going to host Exercise Unitas 2025, which is the longest running exercise in the world. But the U.S. is unusually active in this one. They're going to participate with 2 carrier strike groups for the first time I can find on record, which only went back about 9 years on Southcom's website. But there's also going to be troops from 25 foreign countries meeting in Mayport, Florida in mid-September here, about 15 September. So this is one other thing to note is that the U.S. forces here, all of the forces that are involved except the carriers, have been involved previously, but I haven't seen them all go all at once. So it looks like the U.S. is using much more depth in this one as well, signifying a much greater commitment to the Latin American region. Staying here in the U.S., President Trump declared his meeting with President Putin went very well. He also had an immediate follow-up call with Ukrainian President Zelensky, and several European leaders and NATO that night, just this past Friday. Trump will host Zelensky in the Oval Office today with the goal of achieving a peace deal. As more comes out, I will report on it. And then the Israel Defense Forces reported that they're short at least 10,000 soldiers due to issues with the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community over there. Now, in response, the IDF actually plans to recruit Jews primarily from the United States and France, but the rest of the diaspora as well. The big concern here is that if you have IDF recruiting, you have potential attacks on IDF recruiters because there are pro-Palestine forces abroad.
That's a great point, and it sure seems like the pro-Palestine movement would seize on those opportunities. So you're talking about like an IDF recruiting center in the United States, like an office somewhere, like an Army recruiting center.
They didn't say they would specifically do a center, but at the very least, if you're going to recruit, you need to have recruiters. So the personnel will be present, even if they may not necessarily have a permanent presence.
Mm-hmm. All right. Interesting. Thanks for that, Jared. And let's move on. 46 protests today, well within the baseline. By the way, this past weekend, we saw the Resist the Trump Takeover National Day of Protest or something. It made the news. I think it's been politically insignificant. All of these national days of action have been politically insignificant. But by the way, the next big national day of action is coming up for Labor Day. I was just watching one of their strategy and mobilization calls. So that's coming up, 2 weeks from now or so. Little less than 2 weeks. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on and talk about this DSA National Convention. So this happened earlier this month. This is Democratic Socialists of America, one of the outright socialist parties, and they had their national party conference. And I was just looking through the resolutions that passed and failed, and I have some interesting observations. So several measures failed. 2 of those included one on uniting DSA behind a Palestinian state. Surprisingly, that failed. There was another that would force DSA to align with the BDS movement, which is the anti-Israel boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Both of those failed a party vote. Somewhat interestingly, there's obviously some level of disagreement there on those. But let me talk about 3 that passed that are very important. Number 1 was preparing for May Day 2028. Robert has been talking about this, and I've been adding stuff as well about May Day 2028. UAW director, United Auto Workers director Sean Fain has been, for the past couple of years now, I think, pushing labor unions to renegotiate their contract or negotiate a contract expiration date on or about May Day. And this is in order to basically have all of these unions be able to go on strike, start in 2028. And it's another reason, it's just interesting, DSA passed this resolution, preparing for May Day 2028, almost 3 years away. And why do they need 3 years to prepare for this? This to me is another indicator that 2028 is probably going to be like D-Day kind of year again, potentially. There was a couple other things that passed, which were interesting. Number one, there was a resolution on gaining independence from, quote, capitalist and Democratic Party technology. So apparently they're trying to build their own parallel technology, like for fundraising and other things to get out the vote. And then also building the party to run a socialist for president in 2028. Now, prominent DSA members have expressed disillusionment with the Democrat Party. There was an interesting interview last year from Will Miniker, who was he runs one of the hosts on the Chapo Trap House, which is a Democratic Socialist podcast that was apparently popular several years ago. Haven't heard anything from them recently, but he was talking about the end of the left liberal alliance, and he basically said it is a failed experiment or failed process. You cannot have liberals, like just straight line progressives, and the left work together. And so we've seen a lot of proposals to break off from DSA members to break off from the Democratic Party and specifically back DSA candidates in 2026 and 28 elections. DSA previously announced that they are running 10 congressional candidates as independents. They're not going to run as DSA candidates, obviously. They're going to run as independents against competitive Democrat-held seats in the 2026 midterms. This is something I'm paying attention to because you just look at the demographics of this country. It is obvious that socialism will become a more important political entity or political ideology. And it's something, frankly, that is probably either the future of the Democratic Party or the future of left-wing politics, obviously, as the more moderate boomers begin to lose power and influence in politics. Meanwhile, just to reiterate, this resolution to approve preparations for May Day 2028 is notable due to this possible general strike, which will be a nationwide labor strike in 2028. And another indicator also of just domestic turmoil being ahead in the next general election year. With that, let's go ahead and move on to the gerrymander watch. This is something, Robert, thanks for staying on top of this. This is absolutely crucial. I think this is probably the most important thing that's happening in this country right now. And let's start with this new California congressional map.
So this new map was released by the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, or the DCCC, and this could flip 5 Republican seats to lean Democrat ahead of the 2026 election. And I also saw it could be as many as 6 seats. They're currently targeting 6 districts that are held by Republicans. Right now, the timeline for this is the California Democrats are trying to get a bill passed that will change the state constitution to allow this new map, and then call for a special election. And they're trying to get a vote on this by Thursday. And then if it does pass, the special election will be held on the 4th of November.
Mm. And then is this going to allow them to have this? Well, let me just back up for 1 second. California has to pass a statewide referendum before they actually change this congressional map, correct?
Correct. They have to pass a constitutional amendment to allow them to do a new map without this independent commission, and then also a separate bill to call for the referendum.
Okay. Is California going to be able to do this to affect the 26 midterms?
Well, they have started. They're back in session today. They have until, I think, midnight Friday, basically, to get those done. I think that's realistic possibility. The major obstacle they're probably going to run into is the actual vote, just based on polling right now, where I think it was like 60% of voters polled in California basically want the independent commission to be the only group to be able to propose a new map.
Mm-hmm. All right. So TBA, but potentially very significant. All right, and then let's move on with an update here for Texas.
So Texas, a county district judge expanded a restraining order against former Representative Beto O'Rourke's Powered by People PAC. And the judge ordered basically barred the Powered by People PAC from sending any money outside of Texas to support Texas Democrats that are still in other states, and also barred political fundraising platforms like Act Blue from transferring funds from Powered by People PAC to other PACs outside of Texas as well.
Mm-hmm. And this was happening because Beto O'Rourke was using his political action committee to fund these Texas Democrats who are staying outside the state. And I Robert, by the way, my mistake. We skipped over Indiana.
Oh yeah, so apparently the White House is privately pressuring Indiana Republicans to take up that their own mid-decade redistricting effort in earnest. And according to a Republican close to the White House, they've also invited 4 Indiana Republicans to attend a meeting. I didn't see a date for that meeting, but I think it would probably be this week. And according to that person, they did accept. And an Indiana GOP official who apparently knew about these private phone calls coming from the White House said that Trump is playing for keeps this time, which I think is an important point, because we've been talking about this idea of escalating to de-escalate, and if who would blink first in this mid-decade redistricting, and I don't think it's going to be Trump. And he said that this Indiana GOP official said that if Indiana Republicans think that Trump isn't serious, they're going to be in for basically a very rude awakening going into the midterm elections.
And then, do you know how many Democrat seats could be erased in Indiana? I know it's a red state.
Yeah, I think they were talking 3 seats that could be flipped.
Mm-hmm. You know what's interesting, Robert? Let's speaking of Indiana. Last year, there was this strategy produced by some Democrat group, basically saying, look, you look ahead to the 2028 general election, presidential election. If it comes down to a state Supreme Court, maybe the state house, then we need to be in, Democrats said they need to be in control of these state houses. And so one of the big pushes that was at least offered as a strategy, I don't know if this has been adopted by the Democrat Party or the DNC or the Congressional Campaign Committee, but basically what they said is we need to go into the 7 swing states and make sure we control the state houses of every single swing state, because if we can change how elections work, like open up for mail-in ballots, or do the thing where you can count votes after the election, after election day, after the polls are closed. I mean, just absolutely crazy stuff. Like a mail-in ballot comes in 3 days late, and okay, we're going to count it. So that's one of the things they've been talking about. Would this affect? What are the implications if Democrats do pursue this strategy and they go all in on trying to retake these state houses in the midterms and try to affect the 2028 election? Because this is exactly what they said, at least this group said they were going to do. What are your thoughts on that, just in general?
Well, I think that they have to do that in order to try to bring, because right now there's 26 Republican governors, 24 Democratic governors. So in any fight where it comes down to who controls the battle space on the state level, Republicans have a major advantage. I think it's also, they need to control the state houses to have influence over the state level courts as well. I remember a couple of months ago I saw an internal document. I think it was from North Dakota or Montana. It's a state level Democratic Party document where they outlined basically they have to control the courts as well, or they and I think in their own words was something like they're basically going to be cut off from any control at the state level. So this is probably a strategy they need to engage in order to prevent exactly what's happening now, where Trump is pressuring Republicans, and even some state level Republicans like in Texas are taking the initiative to try to lock Democrats out of House majority.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that we're obviously in post-election America if these parties are developing strategies to redistrict states to maintain political power. Let's just be honest, this is exactly what's happening. I would just say this: what Republicans are doing in Texas and Ohio and other states is a response to what Democrats did in 2020 through illegal immigration, basically artificially creating additional seats for themselves during the reapportionment process. At any rate, this is no longer about elections. I wouldn't even say it's necessarily even about votes. Someone said after the 2020 election, this is not about voters. This is about ballots. It's not whoever can turn out the most voters. It's whoever can show up with the most amount of ballots. I think that's extremely accurate. But if these parties are now basically trying to reshape the political landscape, not just through demographics, not just through voting, but by redistricting, by taking control of state houses and creating these new election laws and regulations that are advantageous to their own party, trying to retake the state Supreme Court so that a state Supreme Court can make a ruling that is politically advantageous, not necessarily reflecting the reality of the election outcome. I don't know, Robert. I don't know how much longer we're going to be able to do this before just the system stops working, basically.
Well, I think the next step is I think this is going to escalate. And the next step, I think, was hinted at. We reported last week that Texas state Republican, I think his name's Leach, who was pushing the state house to now start redistricting the state level House and Senate map. I think that could be the next step at the state level, is these state level parties effectively gerrymandering the state level maps to make sure that they're not losing control of the state houses either. And I think that's going to be escalatory.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I think Indiana was on that list. There was a handful of Democrat states handful of red states that Democrats said we need to really focus and try to take over the state house or break the Republican trifecta. All right. Now let's move on. Speaking of Democrats, they held a protest against redistricting over the weekend. What's the latest?
So activists and labor groups said that they held more than 300 events, rallies, or protests on Saturday to oppose this mid-decade redistricting. And organizers at the Austin, Texas rally at the Capitol building said they had over 5,000 people attending the event. And if I remember correctly, it was Beto O'Rourke, Greg Kazar, and Lloyd Doggett were speakers at that event.
Yeah, I know Greg Kazar. He used to be on the Austin City Council. He is an out-and-out socialist, and now he's a member of Congress, unfortunately. All right. Anything else there, Robert?
Yeah, I think on the larger picture here is that Democrats, they don't have a lot of room to maneuver on this mid-decade redistricting fight. And now that Trump seems committed to this, it's not an escalate to de-escalate thing. I think Democrats are going to continue moving to protests and rallies and to do two things: one, to mobilize their base, and two, to pressure state level Democrats to take up this redistricting fight, either opposing it as doing whatever they can to oppose it in red states and doing whatever they can to get it past these political and legal obstacles in blue states.
Mm-hmm. All right. Some of the unhinged, occasionally we get unhinged people on here. I just want to point this out. Gee, maybe you need to pull that lever harder, daddy, this time. Yeah, Robert, there's a big sentiment that there's no voting anyone's way out of this anymore. And it's concerning, obviously. So, all right, thanks for this. And let's go ahead and move on and talk about China says the Philippines is turning itself into a battlefield. They mean that literally, Jared. Literally.
Yes. Literally. Anyhow, yes. This is coming from one of China's premier military experts, but also they generally just cite their own experts to push an opinion that the government has. Anyhow, now you can see the quote on screen here. This is in response to several things that have happened over the past week with the Philippines. Additionally, China's Ministry of National Defense came out and warned that, hey, China reserves the right to take necessary countermeasures, which, keeping in mind, necessary countermeasures includes the maneuvers we saw on August 11th, which led to a collision between a Chinese Coast Guard and a Chinese Navy ship. So ramming is part of that. Now, these necessary countermeasures are to preserve its territory from the Philippines' actions and statements. I thought the inclusion of statements was particularly concerning because that was in regards to what the Philippine ambassador said last week about working with the United States to get more Nemesis missile systems out to the Philippines. Now, this map, admittedly, it's a little cluttered, but there's a lot of stuff to convey here. You can see the Nemesis range. The last reported spot for it was in the Batanes Islands north of the Philippines, but controlled by the Philippines. The bubble around the Philippines here is where all of the potential coverage is if additional systems are employed. So you can see it would potentially cut off the entire archipelagic waters of the Philippines, which China needs to actually get down to Australia and carry out the threat we covered earlier this year. Additionally, China raised concerns about the Typhoon missile launcher, which we've covered for I think over a year now. They really don't like that thing is there, because that giant red circle is all of the potential hit points for this launcher, and there could be more coming. One thing also to note, the Philippines control Thitu Island, which they call Pagasa, which if they were to place a Nemesis missile launcher onto that shoal, it would actually provide coverage, anti-ship missile coverage, for a lot of China's claims that are well held down there. So you would actually be able to, the Philippines would be able to contest China's claims on it. Mm-hmm. This is a lot of back and forth. Neither side is backing down. So the main takeaway here is that China is showing they are preparing to go to the mat for this. I think this overall indicates that the risk of war starting prior to 2027 is increasing rather than decreasing.
And this would be because we're basically we would force China into action, or what's the thinking there?
Since they are now including words as warfare, the Philippines statement, hey, we're looking to arm up more. And part of China's necessary countermeasures includes the potential application of lethal force, as we saw last week. Okay. I think China's going to get more aggressive here in the South China Sea, take riskier actions. Hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully they back off. But the more risky actions they take, particularly if they're using lethal force, like ramming ships, the more likely it is that they accidentally kill somebody, they go too far, trigger a mutual defense treaty.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's dive a little bit deeper into this. So over the weekend, former national security advisor under Biden, Jake Sullivan, was on one of the Sunday morning talk shows, and he said, basically, Putin won this round of negotiations with Trump over the weekend or last week, because Putin essentially just bought himself some more time, because Trump did not get a ceasefire. It seems to me like if you're China, you don't want the Russia-Ukraine war to end, because that ties up resources and attention and focus from the United States. You obviously do not want to allow the Eye of Sauron to focus singularly on the Indo-Pacific. We've been talking about this since 2022. China is incentivized to act sooner rather than later, because the longer they wait, the stronger this U.S. coalition is going to get between the United States and Taiwan and the Philippines and Japan and Australia and the other Indo-Pacific partners here. I'm having trouble really understanding what is, other than China's relative inability to ensure success. If you're following Sun Tzu, you want to win the war without fighting. And how do you do that? Well, you choke Taiwan out without escalating to a conventional war. Yeah. But I'm not sure China's going to get that scenario here. It doesn't look like they will.
No. We've talked about that we've talked about that privately for members over on the app. But yeah, I think that any attempt to use force to choke Taiwan out pretty much immediately escalates into open warfare. And actually, there was a really interesting set of war games that I think we covered a couple of weeks ago, where they found the same thing. Basically, every time China does that, they apply force in any measurable way, it leads to open warfare. So that basically leaves China has two courses of action: either prepare for open warfare with basically the entire region and the United States, good luck, or continue its gray zone warfare, try to run information ops on Taiwan to really try to influence everybody into joining China, which per the polls that continuously come out of Taiwan, it doesn't look like that's succeeding either. So if your information warfare is not succeeding, but you may possibly win in a military conflict, I think that's a very low likelihood, just to put that out there, but at least you can be more active in it. I think that incentivizes them to go to open war and be prepared for open war. That would necessarily push back their 2027 deadline, by the way, because they're preparing for war with Taiwan, not war with the region. But I don't think they can do one without the other.
Mm-hmm. All right. Interesting. Thanks for that, Jared. Good update as well. All right, let's move on to some questions. By the way, I do for people who have just joined at the top of the show, we talked about the National Guard deployments to DC. And one thing, DC is short about 800 police officers right now compared to 2020, 5 years ago. And so when you get a mobilization of 800 National Guard troops and they're deployed to DC, this is something that the DC mayor actually said was basically have the National Guard kind of backfilling some of these law enforcement spots. Not that they're conducting law enforcement, but I think their presence probably has some deterrent effect. At any rate, Helen says it was in DC 40 years ago. It was wonderful. And I tell you, I went to DC for a job interview and I took a wrong turn somewhere and I saw a black Jesus in a Dudley Q's barber shop. And I said, oh, I'm in the wrong neighborhood. Easy to do in DC, by the way. All right. On that, Jared, what questions do we have lined up here?
All right. Sorry, a little distracted by those comments. So Dan Texas from the private chat. Any reports of dope money from cartels, TCOs, nations using that as a conduit for money into street thugs? So basically laundering money into crime on the street.
I run that by me one more time.
Are there any reports of larger organizations like the cartels, TCOs, nations funneling money into street thugs using drugs?
I don't know.
Okay.
Robert, I think the cartels, my understanding is that cartels are not dealing the drugs. Cartels are facilitating the movement of the drugs, and they're selling the drugs to the street dealers. And so that's basically the street dealer money funds themselves. The money that the cartel makes from selling the drugs fund themselves. I think those are two different pots of money, basically. Now, whether, go ahead, Robert.
No, I agree. They're basically using like the street gangs as a force multiplier for dealing the drugs that they want to distribute. Any money that's flowing upward, or as far as laundering is reported last year or maybe even 2023, has been going on with cooperation with the Chinese organized crime, basically, that are laundering that money for them. That's the only money really flowing upward in that way.
All right. Thanks, Robert.
All right. From James, with both the DSA as independents and the DNC running candidates in 2026, will that split the vote on the left and let the GOP candidate win significantly popular and electoral votes?
Well, in theory, yes, that could happen. But DSA's outlook was they looked at this independent. Actually, Robert, can you search for this? There was an independent in, I think, 2024 in one of the districts, maybe in Nebraska or something like that. He either won or came close to winning. And DSA looked at that. And basically, they said, you've got an independent candidate that almost beat a Democrat. This has to be our strategy. Run 10 congressional candidates in areas where there are close elections and basically force this, not necessarily to win these seats, but basically use this as a show of force. Show the Democrat Party how much support there will be for socialist candidates. And maybe we can get this is what they say. Maybe they can get the Democrat Party to adopt more socialist candidates in the future if they know that they're going to win. So I don't know if this is still the strategy, but this is something that they talked about, I think, last year. This was their midterm election strategy, running these 10 congressional candidates. Robert, if you do, if not, no problem. But do you have any info on who that guy in Nebraska was?
I don't see the candidate, but I did find one of the essays talking about that from 2024, written by Taylor Clark. Basically, they're saying they need a new strategy. And the way they framed it was, well, if the two choices are genocide or more genocide, then they have to figure out a third way to mobilize voters.
Mm-hmm. All right. So just to reiterate, my understanding was that the strategy would show Democrat, if you get 20 or 30% of people showing up in a district to vote for that the outright socialist candidate running as an independent, their conclusion was that you're going to force Democrats to adopt socialist candidates because they know that they're going to win, or they know that they could win by running them as Democrats. That was the strategy. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And any other questions here?
Yes. When both parties gerrymander as much as possible, who wins that fight at the federal level? What is the most likely next step in escalation from the minority party?
All right. Robert, I think CNN over the weekend actually was forced to admit that Republicans would come out ahead. This is something that you said probably 2 weeks ago, that Republicans could gerrymander more seats than Democrats, mainly because blue states are already gerrymandered and they can't get much more out of them.
Yeah, basically, if both sides went full maximalist and were able to squeeze every district out, not just like as many as they could, but I mean every district flipped, Republicans would come out ahead, I think, at least by a handful of seats.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I guess that would have been the escalate to de-escalate strategy, maybe, is basically say, okay, California, yeah, sure, go ahead and gerrymander, and we're going to come out ahead anyway. But I don't think this is escalate to de-escalate. What you said earlier about Trump playing for keeps this time, I think that's 100% accurate. I think the Project 2025 guys, some of the Heritage guys, some other people in the administration they very likely have this outlook that you either curb this now, or there's going to be one party rule in the United States indefinitely. And this is something that I've been saying. I was saying this all the way back in 2019. We are headed towards one party rule. I'm not sure if it's going to be a populist right wing or a populist left wing, but I still think we're headed there. And just real briefly, if you go back and read that book, How Democracies Die by Ziblatt and Levitsky, this is all about how illiberal, basically these right-wing power grabs, how these right-wing movements rise up and defeat democracy. That's why the book's called How Democracies Die. And the whole book's about it. There's a few things about left-wing movements taking over democratic countries, but in almost every circumstance they talk about right-wing groups taking over. And I said, this really is funny. What made all these right-wing groups take over? And I started doing some independent research what was it, G. Gordon Liddy? Or no, it wasn't Liddy. It was, what's the rest of the story guy? And now for the rest of the story, I'm talking about Robert, that guy. At any rate, the rest of the story is that when you start to peel back the layers of this onion, what you find is you have these communist movements threatening to take over the country. And you have a bunch of reactionaries. That's why they're called reactionary politics, is because they are reacting to something. What are they reacting to? They're reacting to communist movements. And so you have these reactionary right-wing movements that beat the communists to the punch. This is something that the authors do not point out in that book, but they should. In almost every single instance of any kind of right-wing national takeover, it is because there is a communist movement threatening to do the same, and they simply beat the communists to the punch. So it seems like to me, if you want to defeat fascism, you want to defeat right-wing reactionary politics, you've got to defeat the communists in all these cases. That's not being done. Robert, what say you?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There was actually an audience comment when we were talking about the resistance to ICE. That said maybe right-wing people can learn from this, that government isn't a juggernaut after all. I think that's actually the opposite lesson. Because in the case in California, where you have the state-level Democrat resistance to immigration enforcement, and in these historical cases, Spain, Portugal, anywhere else where there has been a left-wing revolutionary movement, they either had support from government, or like in Spain especially, the government at the time very heavily supported the communist movements, or they had a direct representation. So like in the analogy we use for the potential American situation, the Irish Troubles, the PIRA and all of the different basically anti English movements had a political party, Sinn Féin, that are now the major political party in Ireland. So that government isn't not a juggernaut. It's actually a center of gravity. It's a battle space fought over between communist and reactionary fascist movements.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's probably what we're looking at. And I imagine the sovereign debt crisis is probably going to kick that off in earnest. At some point, it's going to happen. Ray Dalio says 80% chance over the next 10 years. We'll see what happens. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Any other questions, Jared, from Ford Observer members?
Yep. Last one. What short-term and medium-term changes let me back this up. What short-term and medium-term changes should common Americans expect from a post-election America?
Well, let's define what post-election means. You're talking about single-party rule where we no longer have elections, like authoritarianism. Well, we have a federal system, so I would expect a lot more importance being placed. Well, I don't know. Off the top of my head, it seems like state-level politics are going to become a lot more important because in our federal system, you are going to have state-level pushback against some authoritarian government in D.C. So I think more likely than not, this would probably cause a fracturing of the United States if this were to happen. If it's, I mean, I hate to even say this because it's kind of inconceivable, but at some point in the future, maybe we could see elections being canceled. More often than not, though, what happens in these autocratic systems is you still have elections. You just know who's going to win. So people don't even show up to vote because you know the party in power is going to keep winning. Because, well, who said it? Was it Lenin or Stalin or somebody said it doesn't matter how many votes you have. What really matters is who counts the votes. And that's the kind of system that you would expect to happen. We just see that. So in that kind of post-election America, under this federal system, I think America is eventually going to be primed for balkanization. And just, I don't know, to back up the theory, here's my line of thinking. There's really three things that are three centripetal forces that's pulling the United States together, holding it together right now. Those three things are a relatively strong and stable economy. Arguable, but we do have a relatively stable economy, much more stable than a lot of foreign economies. Relatively strong and stable dollar, also under some duress, but the dollar is still used in a majority of foreign exchange transactions. So it's not, the dollar system's not going anywhere anytime soon. Eventually it will, but it's not in the near term. And the last thing is the perception of free and fair elections, which is also under duress. So basically you have all three of these things under duress. And if those are the three centripetal forces holding the United States together, then the logical conclusion has to be as they weaken, so do those forces that are holding us together, which potentially makes it more likely for us to break apart. And I still think, back in 2016, Ford Observer was a print and digital magazine. And one of our print editions was called End of an Era. And the whole issue basically was about, or the main article was about Balkanization, the history of Balkanization, the Balkan Peninsula. You have Yugoslavia, you have the Ottoman Empire breaking up after it collapses, breaking up into a handful of different countries. Then you have Yugoslavia breaking up into a handful of different countries. That's what Balkanization is. And so, I think that's one of the big kind of strategic outcomes of a post-election America probably would be, is you would probably get secession movements and groups of individual or groups of states potentially breaking away. And that would happen probably on whatever the other side of the autocratic party is. That would be my expectation. All right, Jared, anything else here?
That's
right,
it.
Does anyone want to talk about, Robert or Jared, have you read up on this guy? So and again, this is just headlines. I haven't actually read any articles about this, but apparently the head of some Israeli cybersecurity department was caught in a human trafficking sting operation during Black Hat in Las Vegas. Have any of you seen this?
I saw it. I don't know any more details than what's been put out in the media already. I imagine if he was released, it had to do with some type of effectively a form of diplomatic immunity for foreign government officials.
Yeah. I could have sworn I saw that he was released and went back. Which, if he did, that would make
fairly certain he was. Yeah.
That would make this a non-story because.
By the way, he was
nothing happened to him.
Allegedly a John. He was a user of human trafficking, not actually involved in like the organization of it. Okay. All right. Well, that's all I know. All right. Any good questions here from YouTube?
Let me pull.
Oh, there was a question also. Listen, there have been rumors about Chinese President Xi Jinping's failing health. To my knowledge, they've been rumors, but anytime this guy doesn't show up for a day or two, everyone's like, "Oh, he's in the hospital. He's dying. He's on his deathbed." And then he comes out and he's on video again, and everyone calms down. So this has been happening for years. But Jared, have you seen anything here from the latest?
Yeah. So this is related question to this, and Lay's real talk. I would say be very careful about taking her at face value, because she did the same thing in 2023, and it kind of looked like she just took a vacation. That said, part of the reason it gains traction is that she has a public health issue that is known about, and he treats it with Chinese traditional medicine. If I remember right, it can get complicated, but it's not normally lethal. Like it could be potentially. The ground's there, but just until he dies, I don't see a point in saying, yeah, he's been absent, unless he's been absent for like 6 straight months.
All right. This will be the last question here, and we'll jump off. By the way, we are prioritizing questions from Forward Observer members. We take those every day. Another good reason to join, head over to forwardobserver.com. And last week, I did an hour-long briefing on color revolutions, hit the high points of the strategy, why the color revolution model is being chosen by the left in the United States, by the mainstream kind of establishment in general, not just the left. And then I talk about their strategy, what to expect this year into 26, and then obviously into 2028. I still expect 2028 to be, as Fred Sanford would say, the big on Elizabeth. Maybe we could see some premature culmination of that strategy beforehand. And this is kind of this question here. Could red state redistricting and these National Guard deployments to D.C. bring out enough violent left-wingers to give the left an optics problem? Well, one thing we've seen in Los Angeles and other places is Democrats urging people not to be violent, because they say that plays into the Trump plan, the Trump agenda. Trump gets to look at this and say, look how violent these people are. And then he gets to redouble his efforts, and they don't want him to do that. Not yet. I still think the left in general, I don't even know who to call these people, the powers that be or the establishment. I think they want to get through the midterms first and see what kind of damage they can do if Democrats can take back the House majority, maybe a Senate majority. I don't know. It's too early to say, but we'll see. If they can, then I think things are going to escalate, because now these movements are going to have some legitimacy and some political cover. And then I think the goal would be to bait Trump or bait the Trump administration into an overreaction so that they can continue to build and escalate. If Democrats do not win a House majority, they're all in on this strategy. Every single strategy call I've sat through, all these people, they say, we have to win the midterms. We have to break the Trump trifecta. The only way they're doing that is by retaking the House. If they do not retake the House, I think things are going to have to escalate. And again, so I fully expect early 2027, all the way through 2028, probably going to look a lot like 2017 to 2020. And it's not going to be BLM riots, but it is going to be exactly what they're building, a national resistance movement. We're going to see civil disobedience. We're going to see mass political defiance. One rung above protests in the escalation ladder. So you go from protests, which is what we've seen, to direct action, intervention, strategic noncompliance, or nonviolent methods. That's where we're headed. There will be violence. There is going to be some violence. 100% there will be. But for now, I think Democrats are just, they're continuing to, I think these groups like Indivisible and 5051, I think they're just trying to focus on mobilization. They always say, every time I sign up for one of these strategy calls, I always get this pop-up that says, over 1 million people have joined the movement because they've been referred to a friends. Click here to send an email to all your friends. Click here to send a text message to all your friends. Click here to post this on social media and tag your friends. They're still trying to build. They're still trying to organize. They're still trying to collect as many activists and many people as they can, because eventually we will get to mass mobilization. Remember, the magic number is 12 million. That is when you get Erica Chenoweth and all these other strategic non-violent strategists, strategic non-cooperation and nonviolent tactics strategists say, when you achieve 3.5% of a country involved in a national resistance movement, no regime has survived that. 3.5% of the United States is 12 million. They want to get to 12 million. They're about 3 million now. It was the latest turnout for protests. So they've got a way to work. This is not something you can cold start. You just can't go from 1 million or 2 to 12 million overnight. They're in this rebuilding process. I've been saying this for over a year now, since summer of last year. They're rebuilding. They're going to have to rebuild. They got to reestablish these networks. They've obviously got some funding problems that they're trying to rebuild. So I don't think my current expectation, my baseline expectation, if nothing changes, we probably will not see anything crazy like 2020 until after the midterms. But I think that also depends on what the Trump administration does. If there is some form of trigger event, we'll see. And there could be. There absolutely could be. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's briefing. If we didn't get to your questions, we'll save them for tomorrow, especially folks behind the paywall. ForwardObserver.com if you want to help support our mission. ForwardObserver.com. Sign up for a free 7-day trial. I recorded that 1 hour long briefing on color revolutions every Friday. I also write the economic early warning report. I tell you what the big banks and hedge funds are saying about the state of economic, financial, and monetary conditions. If you're concerned about the dollar, concerned about the economy, that's a report every Friday. It's roughly about 2 pages long. So something you can read in 5 or 10 minutes. It is an excellent overview on what major global investment banks are telling their clients. With that, everyone, thanks so much for your support. We will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.